The following program is being brought to you on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. For more information about our network and to check our additional show hosts and topics of interest, please visit voiceamericahealth.com. The Voice America Talk Radio Network is the worldwide leader in live Internet talk radio. Visit voiceamerica.com. The views and ideas expressed on the following program are strictly those of the host or guests and do not necessarily reflect the views and ideas held by the Voice America Talk Radio Network, its staff, and management.
Welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive with Dr. Rebecca Risk. Do you ever feel that even though nothing seems seriously wrong and you pass all the medical tests, that you still feel that your health, pain, and fatigue are completely out of control? It doesn't have to be that way. Listen to the tips and suggestions given on our program today and take back control of your health. Now, here is Dr. Rebecca Risk.
Hi everybody, welcome to Falling Through the Cracks. I'm your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk, and today we're speaking with Nora Gedgaudas. She is an experienced nutritional consultant, speaker, and educator, and she is a widely recognized expert on what is popularly referred to as the paleo diet. She's the author of the international best-selling book, Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life. Nora, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So what made you decide to write this book?
Well, you know, it's actually it can be a long story. I guess I'm going to try to abbreviate it somewhat for you. But a number of years ago, I was working I was actually supervising a neurofeedback clinic in Eugene, Oregon, and I had just arrived there, and there was a young man that I was working with that who had been diagnosed with ADHD and Tourette's and whatever else have you, and he'd been coming to the clinic for some time prior to my arrival and had really been struggling with his progress. And mind you, we tend to get really great results with all kinds of things doing neurofeedback, but this kid was really struggling, and one day he walked in, and his head was sort of hanging down, and this was an 11-year-old kid, and I thought he was one of the most thoughtful and sweet young men I'd ever met. So he was really special to me. So seeing him down and out just really grabbed me, and I asked him. I said, hey, what's going on? You look really down. He said, well, he said, I was ticking on the way over here, in the car, and it was driving my mom nuts, and then she blew up at me, and now I feel bad, and she feels bad, and I'm like, whoa, you feel bad. I said, what's going on with you? I said, are you angry, upset, you feel guilty, what's going on? He says, well, I feel guilty, he said. Now, this is an 11-year-old male, right? He said, I can't possibly know what it's like for her to have a son like me. And she can't know what it's like for me either. And we walked into the room, and he slumped into the chair and kind of kicked the wall, and he says, I hate this ADHD. I hate all this stuff. I hate the ticking. And I'm thinking, okay, something's really wrong with this picture because this kid really wants to be helped. And so I said, kid, sit tight. I'm going to go and talk to your mom for a minute. So I went into the waiting room, sat down with mom, and I said, how are things going? And she burst into tears and said, I don't know. I just, it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and I just don't know anymore. And we're running out of sessions. We can't afford to go on. And suddenly this light bulb went off in my head. And, I'd spent quite a number of years, as a nutritionist and had sort of, arrived at this sort of new understanding that I have. And I thought, okay, I'm going to put that hat on for a second. And I said, talk to me about what he eats. And the kid was, he'd grab a piece of toast in the morning. He liked to snack on chips and whatever. He doesn't eat, he doesn't eat much protein. He doesn't eat much this or that. He really, he likes his carbs. It's like, okay. So I gave her my elevator version homily, if I do indeed have one. And she kind of looked at me and said, wow, that's a big change, for him. she said, I don't know, that would be a lot. And I said, well, in 2 weeks we're going to know something. I said, I think this is something important to rule out. And she said, okay, the whole family will do it. We'll just all do it together and support him, etc. And I said, okay, that sounds awesome. 1 week later, we had a normal kid. 1 week later, we had a kid who wasn't ticking anymore. 1 week later, we had a kid who was way calmer. Now, he was having cravings for carbs like crazy, and so I talked to my boss about, what do you say about, me making an adjustment to a more hypoglycemic protocol. He said, absolutely, do it, whatever. So I did that, and he leveled out, and we talked about making sure he got more fat and all that. And anyway, my boss came into my room, and he closed the door, and he said, I want you to do what you did with that kid with every single patient that comes into this office. I'm like, okay. And so, and he was adamant about it. He wanted that to be a part of what happened in his clinic. And so, and I was seeing, 10 to 12 clients a day, every day, 5 days a week, lucky to get a 15-minute break for lunch kind of a thing. And so people are filing in, and I'm trying to have this conversation with them, and most of them were fairly interested, but, I start glazing over because it's just too much to take in. And it was quite frustrating, and it was hard for me to do the work that I did. So I went home over the weekend, and in an inspired moment or in a fit of frustration or some combination there, I sat down in front of what was, a typewriter, and I began typing out an article, and it was like a 10-page article, kind of trying to cover some of the basics. And I started printing that off and handing it out to people. And then I'd think, oh, but I forgot this, and I really need to add that, and what about this? And then some of my patients or clients were medical practitioners, were doctors and nurses and things like that, and they'd say, well, this is very interesting, but where do you get this information? It's like, shit, I have to start, excuse my French, I have to start putting, some references. I have to start, providing references for where I'm getting all of this. So I started adding that. And it began to mushroom. And over about, it eventually mushroomed into about a 100-page manuscript that I was running to Kinko's and copying off and getting spiral bound and handing out to, to clients. And eventually, it kind of stayed there for a little while. And then my learning didn't stop. I began to connect some new dots, and I came to some new realizations and was sort of gobsmacked with some things. And I thought, it's time for me to redo this thing, and I need to do it right. I think I just need to put it all in one place and somehow publish it. And that's, I spent, better part of a year rewriting it and adding new material and finding illustrations, etc. And I initially self-published it in 2009, and that just as a thing to do. I had no marketing aspirations. I had no delusions of grandeur with it. I was just wanted to put my ideas in something that could be handed out. Ultimately, it just went kind of viral, and I was eventually, a couple years later, I was being invited to speak at UCLA, invited to speak at all these universities in Australia. It was like crazy what happened with that self-published book. And eventually I got approached by a publisher that said, we love this book and we'd like to do it upright. And I, at that point, had quite a bit of new material. I had lamented not adding, to the other book, some new studies that had just come out, etc. So I jumped at the chance to do it, and I'm really glad I did, because there were a lot of problems with the self-published version.
Yeah. So Nora, what were you, with the diet changes that you were making for people, what do you see as a main thing that most people need to do to get the same results that boy had?
Well, right. So much, of course, I have, so much depends on the individual. A lot depends, but there is a core sort of foundational approach that I take to things. I look at diet and health from an evolutionary, or largely from an evolutionary perspective. At least as the foundations of it come from an evolutionary perspective. In other words, what were the selective pressures that made us who we are, that basically established our nutritional requirements, that established our physiological makeup. And I don't see that as the end piece. I see that as the beginning. From there, the way I nuance it is based upon, I also have looked at human longevity research, because, our ancestors did certain things that they did, and they did a variety of things in different places around the world, and we can't just assume that everything they did was equally good for them. So how would we know what to follow? And longevity research kind of illuminates that pathway a little bit more and allows us to kind of, I guess it's a bit of a pun, but separate the wheat from the chaff. Of course, this is a totally grain-free approach, but and so it distills things down to a more fundamental level of what is likely to optimize human health, what is likely to compromise it. And I also take into account the world that we live in today and currently the selective pressures that we are facing as a species, which I believe are more challenging than anything our ancestors were ever faced with. And so when I distill all that down, I have one particular foundational approach, but then when I meet with individuals, we try to figure out what the individual needs of a person are, to figure out how to nuance that. But that's all nuance. So the foundational approach, which I think is important to probably outline here, because we've gone a few minutes without even really talking about what we're talking about, is that, of course, we are all genetically, 100% of us are genetically hunter-gatherers, whether, no matter what our ideology is, what our wishes might be. That's, physiologically, evolutionarily, genetically, we're all 100% hunter-gatherers. Meaning that we are designed, extremely well designed, in fact, to obtain a highly significant portion of our caloric intake from animal source foods. Does that mean we need to eat a lot of meat? Absolutely not. In fact, the indications are that it's much better to moderate our protein intake to just what we require throughout the day, as opposed to just eating as much as we might want of that. And that it turns out that has some exceptional health benefits, but it does supply us with complete source animal proteins that our body is extremely well designed to handle, not just handle, but to thrive upon, and all the nutrients that go with that. It's not just about protein. It's about all of the nutrients that go with these foods that are frequently not available in plant source foods. And it also appeals to our unique digestive system, which is hydrochloric acid based, meaning that when we ingest protein, our body, complete protein, our body, it stimulates the production of hydrochloric acid and also intrinsic factor, which we need to absorb B12, and sets quite a large range of things in motion. And that hydrochloric acid is not just used to break down the protein, it's also used to ionize the minerals that we require. We have to ionize our minerals, most of them, in order to make healthy use of them. If they're not in ionic form, by the time they hit our bloodstream, we're not really able to do very much with them. That's good. And it also sets the stage for what happens in the rest of our digestive system, because it's the pH of our stomach sets up a signaling process that signals other digestive processes, including pancreatic enzyme release, and bicarbonate release in our small intestine, and cholecystokinin release, which stimulates the release of bile into the small intestine for digestion, and on down the line. And it's all a north to south process. So animal source foods set the stage for healthy digestion. They really do. And then one of the things that it turns out we're not particularly well equipped to deal with is the diet that contains significant amounts of carbohydrate-based foods. When I say carbohydrate-based foods, I'm talking about utilizable carbohydrates. I'm talking about sugar and starch that in the wild, as we were working to survive and in our natural environments, throughout the better part of the year, there wasn't a lot of that sort of thing available to us, and we certainly would have eaten whatever was available. But we had a preferential tendency to seek out the meat and the fat, especially, of extremely large herbivores. And so fat actually would have dominated our diet as calories for the better part of our evolutionary history. We have to remember that the world wasn't as it is now. We became human by surviving disasters, climatic and all other forms of natural changes that challenged us and at times probably made it extremely hard to procure food in any meaningful quantity. And so
Nora, we're going to have to take a quick break here.
Oh, sure.
And we'll pick this up when we come back. Today we're talking to Nora Gedgaudas. She is the author of Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life. We're going to be back shortly.
Your life, your health, your network. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
The largest syndicated alternative health talk program has come to the Voice America Network. The Dr. Bob Martin Show is the program that will answer your health questions and help you to heal your own body of many different ailments. Each week, you'll hear the answers that Dr. Bob gives to his callers that help them to be their own doctor most of the time. We'll also discuss developments on the healthcare front and what you need to do to keep your body in top form. The Dr. Bob Martin Show airs Wednesday mornings at 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific on Voice America Health and Wellness.
We are bombarded with information daily about happy life strategies, beauty products, and business success ideas. Are they truly going to make a change or just take the change out of your pocket? Tune in to Shelley's Show and Tell with host Shelley Hancock. Shelley will explore and recommend proven business ideas as well as show you how to use the law of attraction to create health, happiness, and a prosperous business. Listen Mondays at 1 p.m. Pacific Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Voice America Health and Wellness.
Your life, your health, your network. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Falling Through the Cracks. I'm your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk, and today we're speaking with Nora Gedgaudas. She's the author of Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life. So, Nora, can you tell us, you told that story about the boy who, he was craving carbs, and you just made these changes, and of course he continued to crave carbs, but I know in the paleo diet, grains and gluten especially are a big deal. And can you just explain what's going on there and why that is such a big deal for people?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, basically, for 2.6 million years, as hunter-gatherers, we consumed a diet that was primarily made up of animal source foods and a few assorted plant foods as regionally or seasonally available. And all of a sudden, we arrived at an abrupt and cataclysmic end to what we think of as the last ice age. We're actually still in it, but we've gone through, all these courses, like 90 periods of glacial advance and glacial retreat since we began evolving, and from our primate, antecedents. So, at any rate, all of a sudden, more than half of the world's megafauna suddenly disappeared in the blink of an eye. And this is relatively recently now understood as to why that happened. It used to be thought that they died because we overhunted them or whatever. That isn't what happened. The planet changed, and it changed very abruptly and very decisively, and probably left us without our major food supply. Suddenly no woolly mammoth, suddenly no mastodon, suddenly no giant sloths, no giant aurochs, no Irish elk, and on and on and on of the things that we were accustomed to hunting for food. So we shifted to hunting smaller game that was more fleet of foot and leaner, and fat became that much more precious to us. And it made us highly selective in terms of what we hunted. But we were also kind of forced, I think, in some ways to come up with other options. And there was a development of, or rather, somebody had the idea to cultivate grains. These wild plant foods that were abundant certain times of the year, that could be, sort of picked and stored and seemed to, stay around. And at some point we figured out that we could make beer out of it, and I think that's when the die was cast, really. Must have been a Canadian, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. But at any rate, it forced us to shift from being nomadic to becoming rather stationary. Now, mind you, when you look at the stable isotopic data from human bone collagen remains from throughout human history that is able to evaluate what we ate at different points in our history, there was no point in history prior to the agricultural revolution where grains made up any significant portion. As a matter of fact, they couldn't find really evidence of grains showing up in the stable isotopic data at all. It was all huge amounts of animal protein. But obviously, we would have noshed on them from time to time as we were moving along, and somebody just sort of had the idea to do something with that. And it changed everything. We suddenly began, and so, we became more focused in our population centers, and, we became farmers as opposed to hunters. We went from a hunter-gatherer workday that was maybe about 3 hours worth of work. You hunt, you gather, and you're done, as opposed to 8 hours of backbreaking labor in the fields, toiling for a food source that was relatively new to us as a species, and something to which we had not adapted as a species, and something that was, in any case, greatly nutritionally inferior. And it was also a very carbohydrate-based food. But it's interesting to point out that the protein in grains, which we all know of as gluten, is actually not even digestible by humans. So it wasn't really a viable protein source for us. It was a source of calories. It was something that could keep us alive. And I think that the insulin generated by all of that, probably led to a fairly rapid population growth, because the body sees an opportunity to reproduce it sees an opportunity to reproduce too, and there's a lot of protein, but insulin sort of supercharges that. And so we're living in one place, and suddenly human population growth sort of explodes. But people complain about the idea that hunter-gatherers didn't live a very long life. Oh, we only lived about 40 years back then. And that really, what they're referring to is an average rate of mortality, and that takes into account infant mortality as well. And we have to understand that there's a relative disparity in the rates of hostility between their environment and the modern environment, where we're relatively protected from predators and elements and things like that. And so, but our hunter-gatherer antecedents lived considerably more without disease. They lived much healthier lives, and we know that from looking at, the remains of these people. If you look at the skull morphology of a pre-agriculture human, there's just no comparison. It's virtually, it looks like a work of art. It's perfect in its form. All the teeth fit in the mouths. The palates are broad, and there's no crowding of teeth. There's no bone abnormalities. There aren't any. They can't see any sign of defects in the skeletal structure at all. Tremendous bone density, tremendous muscularity. And what ultimately happened is once we adopted agriculture as a more primary means of procuring our food, we literally lost half of our lifespan in a very short amount of time following that. Mind you, we've gotten a lot of that back thanks to things that are able to prop us up and keep us alive. It sort of reminds me of Weekend at Bernie's a little bit. But
so can you tell us
our health.
Can you tell us a little bit more about gluten? I think that's had a more popularity even than the paleo diet, although I think everybody, has heard of paleo, but, gluten seems to be kind of something that's sticking around. It doesn't seem to be a fad. And having counseled thousands of people, yeah.
No, I mean, the idea that you sometimes see in the popular press that, that's just a fad, or there was one, very funny piece that seemed to claim, they looked at the science, it isn't true, it's all, so yeah, nothing to see here, folks, just move on. Well, that's malarkey. There are hundreds, if not thousands of studies now talking about the various ways in which gluten can impact the life, literally every single organ and system in your body, right from your hair follicles down to your toenails, and pretty much everything in between. It's a food source that we are absolutely not designed to consume in any manner, shape, or form. And one of the things that it does when you consume it is it stimulates the release of an enzyme called zonulin, and zonulin basically controls intestinal permeability. It also controls blood-brain barrier permeability. So it takes your small intestine, which normally has, sort of say, there's a popular New York nightclub, and there is a 7-foot tall and 4-foot wide, bouncer standing at the front door, making sure that only the cool people get in, right? That's sort of what happens in your small intestine. It's highly selectively permeable. It only allows certain things through that belong there. What happens with when zonulin hits your small intestinal wall is that it's kind of like it almost knocks the whole wall down, and it allows whatever to get in. And suddenly the party isn't cool anymore, is it? And so these things are then these frequently not fully digested proteins and things like that manage to get down there, because very few people digest very well, are able to hit your bloodstream, and your immune system sees them and doesn't recognize them as something that belongs. And it signals an alarm that sets up an inflammatory reaction, causes aspects of your immune system to tag that thing as an unwelcome invader, and it becomes an immune reaction. Now, not everybody has an immunologic reactivity to gluten. That's true. 12% of what goes on in gluten immune reactivity, though, is celiac disease, but the vast majority of what goes on with gluten immune reactivity is non-celiac gluten immune reactivity. And they're all equally serious. They are all equally life-threatening, and all have the equal potential to generate, autoimmune conditions and things like that. But you don't have to have gluten immune reactivity in order for what I'm describing to occur. And so every time you eat gluten, you open the floodgates and allow things into your bloodstream to interact with your immune system in ways that can set up an immune response to almost anything you're eating, that have that potential to set up an immune response, particularly if your digestion is not fabulous. And so the other thing is that gluten always damages the gut, always, in everybody, okay? Now, celiac disease is not a gastrointestinal disease. In fact, celiac disease has in recent years been more broadly understood by researchers as probably 7 out of 10 times more directly affecting the brain and nervous system than the gut. But it was originally discovered as something that eroded attacked and eroded the microvilli in the gut through an enzyme called transglutaminase 2. But there's transglutaminase 3, transglutaminase 6. There are all these other transglutaminase enzymes that as a result of gluten can impact adversely in an autoimmune fashion almost any tissue in your body. Now, gluten isn't responsible for every single autoimmune disease. However, it absolutely is a factor in exacerbating every autoimmune disease that exists. And autoimmunity right now is the number 3 cause of death, of morbidity, not 3 cause of death, the number 3 cause of morbidity and mortality in the industrialized world, right behind cancer and heart disease, if we're talking about autoimmunity as a collective whole. And gluten is thought to be contributing factor to all of them. Now, it's sort of interesting because there's overlap here. The number 1 cause of death in a celiac patient is a cardiovascular event. The number 2 cause of death is malignancy. So there's crossover, and these effects, can't necessarily be neatly teased out and separated. As a matter of fact, there was a paper published, it was a little over a year ago now, suggesting that the initiating factor in atherosclerosis appeared to be autoimmune in nature. So, we need to understand that we have this silent epidemic now. And I think one of the things that has occurred is that the incidence of just full-blown celiac disease alone has increased over 400% in just the last 50 years alone. And again, celiac disease comprises only 12% of what makes up the totality of gluten immune reactivity. And so this is a huge problem. Gluten isn't a food, folks. It's a contaminant. There's no reason to have it in anyone's diet. There's no one on earth that is suffering a gluten deficiency or a grain deficiency in general, for that matter. And there are non-gluten grains, but here's another phenomenon, that when it comes to gluten and how it impacts the body, or rather when it comes to the immune system and how it interacts with antigens, right? With substances that have the potential to elicit an immune reactivity. There is a phenomenon known as cross-reactivity that's very well documented. This isn't controversial at all within the field of immunology. It's controversial occasionally in the popular press and on certain blogs and things, but it really isn't controversial in the field of immunology. And what that means is that there are other foods that contain molecules that are either molecularly very similar to gluten, or and it does really amount to molecular mimicry. It amounts to amino acid sequences that are similar to the amino acid sequences found in the gluten molecule. And one of the other culprits are some of the grains that are technically not gluten-containing in the manner that people think about when they think of gluten-free foods, etc. However, they're similar enough, more closely related enough, that in some people, some sensitive people, their immune system cannot tell the difference. Now, interestingly, the most powerful of these, or the most common of these, by far, are dairy proteins. And half of everyone that has gluten immune reactivity also has an immune reactivity to dairy. And when that occurs, that's considered a cross-reactivity. And what that means is that when a person with that cross-reactivity sits down and drinks a glass of milk, they may as well have just eaten a loaf of bread. Their immune system will see them as the same thing and react in exactly the same way. So say they're on a gluten-free diet, but they're still imbibing the dairy. Or other grains include that are potentially cross-reactive include oats, even gluten-free oats, include millet, include corn and rice, believe it or not. There's an interesting thing that seems to happen with crappy instant coffee. There's something in the coffee bean that has been highly processed, whether it's instant coffee or whether it's just the pre-ground, highly processed crap that usually comes in sealed cans, and I won't name brand names. But when a person is cross-reactive to that, it's a particularly virulent cross-reactivity, and we're not exactly sure, or I should say the researchers doing this are not exactly sure, I'm friends with some of them, whether it has to do with changes that have occurred during the processing to the proteins contained in these things, or whether it has to do with cross-contamination based on how these the environments in which these foods are processed.
Nora, we're going to have to take a quick break here.
Break. Okay.
Yeah, so this is great information, and anybody that's listening, Nora's book is full of way more than this, and this is called Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life. So if you're finding any of this interesting, you'll find way more information in this book. We're talking today with Nora Gedgaudas. She is an experienced nutritional consultant, and we are discussing her book. We're going to be back shortly with Nora, so stay tuned.
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
Hi, I'm John Rainey, Chief Financial Officer of United Airlines, and I'm honored to be the National Chair for the 2015 March for Babies campaign for the March of Dimes. United is a proud supporter of the March of Dimes mission to improve the health of babies and fight premature birth. We're helping the March of Dimes fund breakthroughs in research and community programs that help more mothers have full-term pregnancies and healthy babies. Please join us in working together for stronger, healthier babies. Visit marchofdimes.org.
Frankly Speaking About Cancer is a program designed to empower survivors and their caregivers to deal with the social and emotional challenges of cancer. The show will invite physicians, researchers, nurses, social workers, patients, and caregivers to share their advice on how to live a better life with cancer. Join host Kim Tibaldo, President and CEO of the Cancer Support Community, Tuesday afternoons at 1 p.m. Pacific Time and 4 p.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Network.
Opinions, options, answers. You're listening to Voice America Health and Wellness.
You are listening to Falling Through the Cracks with your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. To reach the program today, please call in to 1-866-472-5792. Again, that's 1-866-472-5792. You may also send an email directly to Dr. Risk. The email address is anantacalgary@gmail.com. Now, back to Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Falling Through the Cracks. I'm your host, Dr. Rebecca Risk. Today we're speaking with Nora Gedgaudas. She is the author of Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life. So Nora, we talked before the break about gluten and gluten sensitivity and celiac. How can somebody find out that they do have a gluten sensitivity or a celiac disease?
Right. So there's only really, I talk to a lot of people that say, oh, yeah, I tested for that, and they said I don't have it. People have to realize that the way that gluten is tested for, or gluten sensitivity rather, and celiac are tested for, is an antiquated method of testing that is maybe at best 25% accurate. By far, false negatives are the norm and not the exception. And you have to understand there are at least 9 different proteomes of gluten that are commonly known to elicit an immune response in people. And what labs routinely test for is just one, which is alpha-gliadin. And the other thing is that we have a variety of immunoglobulins. We have IgA, IgG, etc. immunoglobulins. We have others as well, but IgA and IgG are the primary ones when it comes to identifying immune reactivity. The only one for which is ever tested with is IgA. And it's very common for people to be depleted in IgA. If you've been under a lot of stress, of course, I don't know anybody like that, but if you've been under a lot of stress or you're depleted in some way, your IgA levels may be in the toilet. And if you don't have any of that immunoglobulin to react with, then and say, for instance, you don't necessarily have a reactivity to alpha-gliadin, but you react like crazy to omega-gliadin, or you are just, your immune system lights up like a Christmas tree when it's exposed to wheat germ agglutinin or to gluteomorphin or to protonorphin, etc., then you're basically going to be in the dark with the answers that come to you. You'll get a negative, and it'll tell you you're fine when you're not fine. There's only one lab on Earth that actually bothers to look at all 9 proteomes, which is 8 more than anybody bothers to test for, and also looks at IgA and IgG and immune reactivity. And to those proteomes, in addition to looking at whether or not you are generating activity with transglutaminase enzymes, which can imply specific tissues that gluten may be targeting and damaging currently. It looks at that. And all of this is, the quality control is such that everything is tested within tests within 1 to 2 standards of deviation of sensitivity. In other words, most labs, maybe have 6 or 7 or 10, degrees of standards of deviation of sensitivity that allow a lot more things to fall through the cracks. Very little falls through the cracks with Cyrex. They are the most accurate, the most comprehensive. They're at least a decade ahead of everybody else. And a lot of their testing is highly proprietary. And so it's the only lab I recommend. I think almost any other form of gluten testing is quite literally a waste of time, including intestinal biopsies, as a determinant of whether you have gluten problems or celiac disease even. Because celiac disease most often affects the brain and nervous system and not the gut. Only some percentage of the time does it affect the gut. So,
well, that's one of the comments that you hear a lot from people where, they eliminate gluten and their gut doesn't change, but they'll have more energy and their brain fog is gone and their joint pain is gone, and they feel better overall. They're sleeping better.
Yes.
But,
well, there are other things that could be happening with them, but yeah, absolutely. There's nothing but good things that can happen to anybody that eliminates grains and gluten from their diet. There's no reason to have them. We're not genetically adapted to them. They're immunologically basically, a liability for us, more than they are a benefit. And yes, they contain some nutrients. Most of those nutrients are bound up in phytates and fiber and things like that through which our body cannot access, because we can't digest them properly. And there isn't a single nutrient present in grains that is not present in animal source foods and in much higher levels and in more bioavailable levels, and in other foods as well, like various fibrous vegetables and greens. If you were to look at my dinner plate, for instance, you would see an absence of any kind of sugar or starch. You would see maybe 2 to 3 ounces of protein from some manner of animal source food, or possibly uncontaminated fish, which is harder and harder to find. And you would see more vegetables on my plate than anything else. But vegetables have almost negligible caloric contribution. The majority of the calories actually are coming from fat, from both the animal source foods on my plate and from, to other things that I add to it. There may be some avocado, there may be olive oil on the greens. I tend to cook my foods in things like tallow or things like duck fat, or sometimes there's a cultured ghee that is totally protein-free, made by Pure Indian Foods. Best ghee on the planet. It's called cultured ghee, and it's one particular type of ghee that they carry that actually has been certified protein-free. So it's literally the only dairy product that I consume. I don't do butter because it contains too many milk solids that I can cross-react to. And I'll use coconut oil, which is, perfectly legit. It's actually a great oil to cook with. It's very stable, provides some good medium chain fats that are great for your immune function and other things.
So I think this might be a good place. Oil. I think this might be a good place to talk about, especially in your first story, you said with that boy that you had increased his fats. And I think this is something important to bring awareness to, that a lot of people are actually afraid of fats because of that low-fat fad that went through our society. Can you explain how important those are?
Yeah, it's been nearly a century of misinformation. And a lot of it was driven by the interests of the sugar industry, and that has actually recently come out in the press, where documents were discovered in which there was a whole campaign by the sugar industry to make fat look like it was, when they were trying to figure out what was causing cardiovascular disease. Dr. Paul Dudley White, who wrote the very first textbook on cardiology, on cardiovascular disease, rather, he knew that fat wasn't the problem. He believed sugar was the problem. But there were political forces and lobbyists in place that wanted to suppress what was coming out about cardiovascular disease, which is a modern-day phenomenon, okay? Modern-day phenomenon. If you graduated medical school in 1910, you never heard of anything, called, cardiovascular disease. In 1911, the first 4 papers on the subject were published in the Journal of the American Medical Association as some odd outlying weird thing that was popping up here and there. By 1950, it was the leading cause of death. Did we suddenly start eating lots of fat and cholesterol? We'd been eating fat and cholesterol for 2.6 million years, and now it's catching up with us. It was the introduction of you have to realize we went from a diet that was mostly a fat-based diet in terms of caloric intake to one that suddenly became dominated by carbohydrates for the first time in human history, and generating tidal waves of insulin to which we have very little defense. And when you produce tidal waves of insulin all the time, you're bound to generate insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is what leads to metabolic diseases, is what leads to obesity, and what leads to, is a contributory cause of things like diabetes and heart disease and cancer, for that matter. Cancer is being increasingly recognized now, not as a genetic disorder, but as a metabolic disease. And there is a paradigm shift occurring now in some circles in medicine that are beginning to recognize that and are having much better success treating cancer when they approach it from that, more simplified perspective. So fat is not the problem. It never was. Naturally occurring fat from animals that have been fed a diet that is natural to them. And by that, I mean 100% grass-fed and finished foods, 100%, pastured meats, chicken, pork, whatever, as opposed to animals that have been raised in feedlots. And unfortunately, 97% of the meat that's consumed today comes from these horrifying, operations called, confined animal feedlot operations, and they are polluting, they are detrimental to the environment, and I have nothing to do with any kind of meat that comes from that type of production. And unfortunately, it's 97% of the meat production. None of that changes, folks, until, we demand something different. This planet was blackened by ruminant animals that thundered across the landscape for tens of millions of years before we ever came along, and the planet did just fine. And as a matter of fact, where natural systems are, where the raising of ruminant animals for food is adopted as a more natural systems approach, there is no loss of habitat for other animals the way there is for agricultural endeavors or feedlot endeavors. The whole feedlot industry depends on the agricultural industry to sustain itself. And a lot of what animals are fed are genetically modified feeds, and they're shot full of hormones and antibiotics, and they're filled themselves with stress hormones from the horrible lives that they lead, and we get to ingest that. That kind of meat is not food. The health of the meat you eat depends upon the health of the animal that meat came from. Now, you can get as many omega-3s per gram in a piece of grass-fed meat, right? The omega-3s that feed your brain, that are actually in part what differentiate us from every other species, because it's that essential fatty acid that dominates the composition of our brain, whereas it's omega-6s that dominates the brains of primates. So omega-3s have given us this amazing brain. You can get as many, and if they're not in your diet, folks, they're not in your brain. Okay, the forms of omega-3 that we need come from animal source foods only, and you can get as many in a piece of meat as you would from a piece of wild-caught salmon, if that piece of meat was from an animal that ate a diet of nothing but natural forage its entire life. Not where it ate grass for 9/10 of its life and then it was thrown into a feedlot for the last few weeks. The omega-3s go away. If you get a piece of meat that spent any time in a feedlot, chances are the omega-3s are gone. Chances are a lot of the nutrients are gone. Beta-carotene, there's beta-carotene in meat, by the way, folks, that's grass-fed. A lot of the beneficial nutrients, CLA, conjugated alpha-linolenic acid, which is known to be very anti-cancer, one of the most anti-cancer nutrients around, that goes away in feedlot meat.
Nora, I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm going to have to end the show shortly, and I just want to make sure before we end, if there's a way people can get in touch with you if they have more questions. Your book is so full of this kind of information, and I'm sure that we're going to be leaving people with a lot of questions. So is there a way that people can contact you?
Yeah, my website is www.primalbody-primalmind.com. And there's a contact information is there. There's a lot of free information. I used to have a Voice America podcast myself, and all of those are available there. They're free for download on my website. And I also have a lot of articles. There's a lot of information, a lot of free information. I also have, for people that are inclined to get a more thorough education on the subject matter, a mastermind series currently that I'm getting ready to start. That is a 10 or 12-week educational series that is extremely in-depth and thorough, and I'm only limiting it to 30 people. So, and it's closing fast. There are very few spots left on this. So people are interested. They can inquire about that, and they will be sent information. And I also have a new book coming out in mid-January that's being published by Simon & Schuster here in the States and Allen & Unwin in the UK, throughout the UK, major publisher there. It's called Primal Fat Burner. No, it's not just a diet book or something like that. It's a heck of a lot more than that. And it's going to actually offer some things that have never been really said before, that have been needed to be said for a long time. So I think that's going to be a big one.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining me today. This was a very informative show, so I appreciate you joining me.
I appreciate the invitation to be here, and I'm very, 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 very happy to have been able to, offer some, insights about, about this whole thing. And again, people shouldn't hesitate to contact me if they have any further questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nora. We were talking today with Nora Gedgaudas. She's the author of the book, Primal Body, Primal Mind, Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and be sure to make today a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's edition of Falling Through the Cracks. Feel alive and thrive. Please join Dr. Rebecca Risk again next Monday at noon Eastern Time and 9 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness channel. We'll talk more next week.